Hi everyone, I'm Imogen from Course Report, and we are a resource for researching which coding bootcamp is right for you. We have a directory of different coding schools, tons of reviews, a blog, and interviews with founders, instructors, and students, all to help you work out which bootcamp you want to go to. Today, I'm excited to be speaking with Khurram, who is the co-founder and head of education of Lighthouse Labs, a coding bootcamp with 8 campuses across Canada. Lighthouse Labs started in 2013 and has recently made some big changes to the web development curriculum. Khurram is going to tell us about his background and how he started Lighthouse Labs and explain to us the evolution of the school's curriculum and teaching style. So Khurram, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So maybe we can start and you could tell us about your background and how and why you ended up co-founding Lighthouse Labs.
Absolutely. So I myself, as you mentioned, am a co-founder and head of education at Lighthouse Labs. I have been a software developer for over 10 years, and I've gone through the entire journey of going from school, academics, and into the workforce, my first job, which was very, very uncomfortable and nerve-wracking as a developer. And so I've experienced all of that. And then on the flip side, for the last 5 years, I've owned another company that is a software development firm out in Toronto that works with various different small to large businesses to produce software for their needs. And in doing that, I've also experienced the hiring side of things, and the massive shortage of developers and the type of talent that is out there. So I've combined those experiences as well as my passion for teaching. Actually, it all started when I was very young. At the age of 8 is when I actually started volunteering at a local community center back home in Pakistan to teach adults how to use computers and become literate with computers. Everything from teaching them a little bit of programming and coding with BASIC and using DOS and a little bit of word processing. And then I went and was lucky enough to have computer science in high school. Found that I fell in love with software development through languages like C and Visual Basic, and helped the school actually develop some of the curriculum with Java while I was learning it. So it was, without realizing it, I actually found my passion, both my passions together, which was learning and building software, but then also inspiring others and teaching them how to build and create. I think software development, I feel incredibly lucky to have gone into this field, and I want to inspire other people to consider becoming software developers and essentially be the craftsmen of the future, as I like to say.
That's so cool. And then what kind of prompted you to actually start this boot camp in Canada?
A few things. So as I was doing consulting and software development, I found that one of the things I was doing quite a bit of was mentoring junior developers who had recently graduated and had some great success in doing so, and found that I really enjoyed doing that. So I started actually looking for opportunities where I could mentor and teach part-time. This was in Toronto. I've since then moved to Vancouver. And I found that I could have, taken the traditional approach of I'm going to become a part-time instructor at a local technical college. But at the same time, I started becoming more and more aware of this movement in the education space towards more hands-on learning. And instead of my goal was, okay, I will teach part-time at a college and then eventually try to change the system from within in what I believe to be a more progressive model, where students are really learning by doing and put into a uncomfortable situation and a very intense period, so that they are getting used to what it means to be a developer, because the ground is constantly shifting under you and you're always learning. But instead, I learned about boot camps and was actually involved in building the curriculum for and helping build the curriculum for and teach at one of the first boot camps, the first boot camp in Canada. And so that inspired me as well. I fell in love with the methodologies, with the concept with the students. I mean, it was just a phenomenal experience, even though it was part-time while I was still CTO of my own startup. You know, having worked at various different companies that have been startups that have since, you know, either exploded or gone under, having worked at organizations that are more governmental, institutional, it gives you a breadth of perspective on what different types of developers are out there. And you know, I saw the education space myself. I have gone through an undergraduate degree for 4 years. But what I found most valuable about that experience was actually the co-op or internship that I did for a few of those semesters. I found that I learned way more on the job than I did in the many of the theoretical courses that I learned, even in the later years of undergrad. And that made me realize that, you know, when you speak to a senior developer or just an experienced professional of any kind, and you ask them, you know, where did you learn what it means, or where did you learn to be a developer, or where did you learn your trade or your craft, your profession? How did you become so good at it? They will almost never say, oh yeah, I went to university such and such, or even I went to this boot camp and that's really why I'm so good at what I do now. I think a lot of it is I learned on the job. You know, I learned by being uncomfortable, and I learned by constantly growing and learning. And that is something that is the essence of what Lighthouse Labs is. It's embracing the fact that you're going to learn most on the job, and it's really about getting you there as fast as possible. And making you impactful for the first few months, and so that you can actually continue to grow and learn at bootcamp pace. You know, one of the things we tell our students on day one and in the admissions process is this is not a 8-week or 9-week bootcamp. You're going to be doing bootcamp style learning for many years, especially the first 6 to 12 months of your life. This is going to be an intense journey, and you really have to have not only the talent but also the grit to be able to handle that kind of intensity and not take your foot off the pedal once you graduate from a boot camp.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And then once you decided to start the boot camp, how did you and where did you find the instructors to employ for the boot camp?
Oh, that is one of our biggest accomplishments, I would like to say. I call ourselves following what I call the community-driven education model. It's just something, I haven't really heard that term outside of us using it, to be quite honest, but I do feel that one of the biggest advantages of Lighthouse Labs and one of our biggest philosophies is really bringing the community together to rally behind the education and the teaching. Instead of just having a few full-time instructors, our goal is very much to have essentially an army of developers who are passionate about two things, who are passionate about the work that they're doing primarily outside of Lighthouse Labs in terms of whatever ecosystem or language or framework that they're using. And we do this with both web and iOS. We started with web, and so one of the first things I did when I got to Vancouver from Toronto was really talk to as many developers as possible to see what the consensus was, what the feeling was about not only in terms of the ecosystem here in Vancouver, and I of course knew about Toronto, but also what their appetite was in terms of mentoring without any kind of formal training and teaching, right? This takes a completely different skill set than writing code. And the trick is to find mentors and teachers who a talent for both. And so that took some time. We started with 3 part-time, we call them mentors, teachers, and myself as the main full-time teacher. And we grew from there. And within a few months, that number went into the double digits. And now we have over 100 mentors teaching across web and iOS in Canada. And so we have a few full-time educational staff that are involved in curriculum building, our internal software systems, as well as, of course, delivering lectures. But the main focus of the curriculum and the experience is really around bringing these mentors in and the experience that it creates. We talk about immersive education, right? This is what boot camps are about. And a lot of times we say, well, it's immersive education, and people visualize, well, that just means I'm going to be immersed in code and immersed in my laptop. That's the first thing that you think of, right? Well, one of the things that people don't realize is it's about being immersed in the community and the culture. that's something that really can't be left to just, I'll do that afterwards. In order to really appreciate whether this is something that you're going to continue on and to really understand what software development is, you have to also appreciate the mindset and the culture and the people of the local community where you're going to be working. And I think that was when I came here, I wanted to make sure that I became a part of the community. Over the last 3 years, I have made a lot of had a lot of different conversations around that. And so our belief is very much around bringing those developers in to inspire the next generation of students.
That's really cool. Sounds like it's working really well. And yeah, so I'm really interested in the curriculum, and I was wondering if maybe you can just start by telling me how you first developed the curriculum back when you started in 2013. Like, how did you decide what you were going to teach at that point?
Absolutely. I had been working with Ruby and seen the growth of Ruby and Rails as an ecosystem for quite some time. I started off as a junior Rails developer for a startup that eventually got actually acquired by Google, which was really interesting. And in that process, I learned to appreciate sort of the growth and where the community had matured to. The initial stages of the Ruby and Rails ecosystem, I was not a big fan of. It was definitely a lot more of the shooting from the hip and less of a mature community in terms of the tooling and the support and the types of questions and answers that you found out there. A lot of wrong answers and things of that nature. But by the time we started Lighthouse Labs, that community, that ecosystem had matured quite a bit. And so it made sense for me to say, okay, given where Ruby and Rails is as an ecosystem, the fact that it's a more mature, stable community, and it's a platform that's being used by many, many employers across Canada globally, it made sense to teach those tools. But at the same time, also keeping in mind that it's not really about learning Rails. That's something that I've said from the very beginning, is this is not a Rails bootcamp. It's not a Rails program. It's not even necessarily a Ruby program. It's really about learning full stack web development with Ruby, with Rails, with SQL, with HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And so these are just the tools that we've decided to use. They're definitely popular, but there are many equally good alternatives to Ruby, to Rails, and they offer different paradigms and different schools of thought. And any good developer should be comfortable, if not a master, in at least 2 different programming paradigms, and therefore at least two different ecosystems and 9 languages. So we definitely celebrate not pigeonholing our students in one language or one framework. In terms of how I went about developing it, definitely very high level at first in terms of creating an outline, talking to as many individuals in the community as possible. I remember having a conversation with Director of Engineering at Hootsuite as one of the very first things I did when I got to Vancouver, and showed them our curriculum outline. Hootsuite at the time, and even now, is not a Ruby shop. They are heavily invested into Scala, into Java, and Python. And so the Director of Engineering took a look at the curriculum, saw, had a conversation with me, and saw the curriculum focused on or using Ruby and Rails, and did not for a second say, oh, this is an issue for me, I wouldn't hire from Lighthouse Labs. They very much understood, after having a conversation with me, the philosophy behind what we're actually going to be teaching, which is learning how to become a developer in a rapid way, by really being analytical, by problem solving, and getting used to and learning how to research a specific problem. Debugging is probably one of the core things that we focus on as a skill set, less so compared to learning JavaScript or learning Ruby. A lot of the exercises and activities are built around that. Now, when I first started, it was definitely pretty rough around the edges. For example, we started with a small set of students, right? We had 6 students, so I was able to quickly iterate and adjust things based on how the first cohort was running. But I quickly found that I was jumping into Rails too soon, and students had a little bit of a glazed look on their face, a little bit of a shell shock from experiencing a monolithic framework that had way too many different pieces that they were not comfortable with. I, within the first few cohorts, adjusted it and made it so that there was more ramp up towards learning a framework and appreciating why frameworks exist. Learning Rails, or learning a big framework like Rails, I say is analogous to jumping into something like Game of Thrones in season 5. You know, Rails 5 is essentially out, and starting with that is like starting Game of Thrones season 5 without having watched seasons 1 through 4. You have no idea what the characters are really doing, why they're doing, what motivates those characters. These are characters on the screen, but you know, what they're trying to do and what the history behind them is. And so taking them through that journey of understanding and appreciating web development at a core level, so that they understand why these frameworks exist and how they've evolved over time, and giving them more of that context and history is equally important to this is how you do something in Ruby or JavaScript or Rails. One of the other things, actually, I should say is when it first started, I wanted to figure out how to measure and evaluate student progress. And that's something that has taken quite a few months, if not years, to really figure out, because there are two sides to education. There is the knowledge transfer and teaching, but then there is also the evaluation side. And this is something I feel that a lot of boot camps, Lighthouse initially included as well, was not focused enough on. And I within the first few cohorts, did something that some might raise an eyebrow to. I actually introduced assessment tests, basically exams, that students had to pass in order to be considered graduates of Lighthouse Labs. This is something that I learned from my experiences at previous boot camps and just watching others. They were not doing this. It was, to me, not enough of a evaluation piece where they could say, okay, we feel that these students are ready for the workforce. So yes, there's intensity. Yes, there's a lot of different learning involved, but are the students actually able to show that they're progressing at that velocity? And so we've since then added a few assessment tests that, you know, we make sure that we try to make the students feel as comfortable as possible so that they're not getting test anxiety while they're trying to solve these coding challenges on their own without any help from mentors, but with, of course, you know, access to the internet to try and simulate the real world as much as possible.
Cool. Yeah, that makes total sense, and I think that assessment idea sounds really cool. I like that.
Yeah.
So now I'm interested in your recent updates to the web development curriculum. What have you guys decided to do and change to improve it?
Absolutely. So everything we've done over the past year, I would say, has been a result of all the feedback that we've gotten from our alumni, from our mentors. I mentioned we have quite a few mentors who are senior developers who work in these various communities, and from our employers as well. I'm just speaking with them. Ruby, Rails are excellent languages, frameworks to learn. They're highly relevant. Most of our web applications internally that we've built, thanks to our students and mentors, have been built with these technologies. But one of the feedback that we got was it would be nice to have more emphasis on JavaScript as a very different paradigm and language and ecosystem to the Ruby side. And so that's something that we've gone and made. And that was a result of the feedback that we received. And another reason, you know, why we did that is to really celebrate polyglot developers. I said earlier that developers, good developers, should be comfortable with multiple paradigms and multiple languages. And that's, you know, goes back to the feedback that we got, that students felt that they had to do a lot more on their own after the program to feel comfortable with functional programming and JavaScript and the fast-moving ecosystem of JavaScript, right? It's going through quite a bit of growth and disruption and innovation, which is really, really interesting. So one of the things that we've done with this new curriculum, one of the many things that we've done, is bring in more JavaScript while keeping a fair amount of Ruby and Rails, so that there is this polyglot approach to, hey, let's take a look at two very different ways of solving the same problem.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to ask, like, I know a lot of boot camps now are just teaching full stack JavaScript without another object-oriented language, and I was wondering if you guys considered at all just teaching full stack JavaScript.
It was definitely a conversation. So when we started thinking about this version 2.0 of our curriculum, and this was, not recently, this was a year ago. So this was something that we put a lot of thought and conversation behind. We, within Slack, had long conversations in a private channel with all our mentors, first of all saying, how do we feel about this? How would we approach teaching JavaScript? There's so many, one of the challenges with teaching with JavaScript is, unlike with Ruby, there are a lot of different opinions on writing idiomatic JavaScript. Different developers have different styles. Different shops have different philosophies that are conflicting with each other. And so how do we do that? Do we teach all JavaScript, as you brought up? And for the most part, the consensus was that there's a lot of value in teaching what is called classical object-oriented programming, class-based, as opposed to the prototype-based object-oriented programming that JavaScript brings. And so it's good to expose the students to both. Of course, it adds the risk of overwhelming them with too much information. And so we had to make sure that we crafted the curriculum in such a way that there is enough, there's still a primary focus, and then there is a secondary focus at the tail end that exposes them to the other paradigm and lets them compare and contrast without feeling overwhelmed. But also taking advantage of the fact that once somebody is in the latter part of the bootcamp, they have an anchor from the first few weeks, as well as from the prep work, in order to be able to anchor that knowledge and compare something against and have an opinion about how they feel about classical object-oriented programming versus the other way. So in terms of being prepared for the workforce, which is our ultimate goal, we felt that introducing them to both paradigms and both languages would work better in a short period of time. The truth is, our developers may go and work, our alumni may go and work in a completely different language. And so the way we teach Rails and Ruby in the new curriculum is actually simulating that feeling. And this was another feedback that we got from students, was we should be simulating that more. And so the way we teach Ruby and Rails now is to say, okay, you're almost done with the bootcamp. What we're going to do now is throw an existing Rails project at you that you've never even seen before, let alone your comfort level or knowledge of Ruby is very rudimentary. And now what we're going to simulate is that you have this backlog of bugs and features that you have to implement while learning this framework. Of course, you have mentors there to support you, but that experience is something that's very new to our curriculum, that they generally experienced before in their internships or jobs right after bootcamp.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds like an awesome approach. I like it.
Thank you.
And I was wondering, kind of just in general, what is your process of iterating and updating the curriculum when kind of updates to technology come out and things like that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because that is one of the things in version 2.0 that I'm extremely proud of. And this is more the behind the scenes work that I've been doing for the past little while. It's decoupling our curriculum from our technology. So previously, all our curriculum was embedded in our learning management system that was built with Ruby, with Rails, over the course of a few years with students and mentors, with our alumni, actually. And in doing so, what we've done is actually taken our curriculum and modified it such that it actually sits on its own. And it allows developers to use what we're comfortable with, GitHub and Git, to be able to contribute to curriculum. So now, I mentioned to you community-driven education, where we bring mentors from the local communities, developers from the local communities to be mentors. But one of the things I found that we were not doing was using them to help iterate and evolve the curriculum as much as we could have been. And so this is the thing that I'm most excited about, is being able to have workflow and systems in place and more conversations in place for iterating on the curriculum. It also helps that JavaScript as a language and ecosystem is evolving much quicker than the Ruby ecosystem, which is, has kind of stabilized over the last few years. And so that forces us to be highly iterative and rapid, and react and evolve to the changes, not just in libraries and frameworks, but even the language itself is changing at such a rapid pace that it's something that comes out of necessity, but also the teachers are extremely excited to be able to have more first-class kind of say and contribution to the curriculum than they did before.
Cool, that's awesome. Now, I think you guys have to be licensed with the PCTIA, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you have to kind of notify them or talk to them when you're making kind of a slightly bigger change, like focusing more on JavaScript.
Absolutely. Canada is a country that has generally, I'm generalizing here, quite a few more regulations around core services, and education is definitely high on that list. We were very cooperative early on with PICTIA, as it's called here in British Columbia, when we started Lighthouse Labs, and it took us some time to work with the system, but still stay agile in order to stay compliant and be registered. And we're now actually accredited with PCTIA, which takes two years of being in operation, and opens us up to a lot of other advantages and our students. Yes, absolutely. So we have actually somebody here on staff who is basically a dedicated person in communicating with the regulatory bodies here in Canada. They're in constant communication with PCTIA, as well as the Ontario equivalent of PCTIA, in order to just make sure that we are keeping them in the loop, as well as following the right practices and keeping everybody comfortable. And by no means am I complaining. I think these organizations exist with a very important intention, which is the interest of the students, to make sure that they are getting not only good education, but there actually is follow through on that, to protect them from things like schools going under and them losing money, or schools not really following through on learning outcomes that they are promising to be teaching.
I love that. That's such a cool attitude to have. It's very nice.
Thank you.
And I was wondering, when you're making these kind of iterations and changes to the curriculum, how do you kind of keep your instructors up to date with those and make sure they're kind of trained on whatever new technologies you're going to be teaching?
Absolutely. So rolling out of a new curriculum or even iterations is not an easy feat, especially when you have multiple locations across a country with a lot of different mentors, multiple programs. We're changing not just the content, but also the evaluation side of things, and just some of the core philosophies in terms of how we teach have been mutated a little bit based on our learnings. And so how do you train the various different mentors and staff on these changes? It affects everything. It affects our career services department equally. And so one of the first things we did with this new curriculum, knowing that any new piece of software, being software developers, we know anything new we create, we don't have egos or pride about it, and there are going to be a lot of bugs. And so we have a pilot actually of the new curriculum that we used to test and iterate on the new version, and also to use to train and figure out how we're going to be training across the board. So the curriculum isn't just about what's student-facing, but it's also about what's teacher-facing in terms of the documentation and the changes. Much like software has a change log of this is what's changed from version 0.5 to 1.0. We've been tracking all the changes that we have, not just in Git, but also in our internal documentation. And then it's a matter of, for me to communicate these to all the different teachers. It's also about bringing them into the conversation versus just doing something secretly and then saying, hey, everybody, this is what we're doing. It's a combination of both, actually. And so the individuals involved in building the curriculum are our teachers. I actually just sent out recently an email to all the mentors thanking them and highlighting the individuals that were involved in helping us build this new curriculum. And the list is not small. It's a list, and it is mentors and teachers from across Canada, not just people that a small group of the curriculum team that works here. So really, it's about bringing them in to be contributors and collaborators on it. And then you have buy-in from all the developers that are going to be involved in teaching, and they'll help distribute that knowledge across Canada, which is the approach that we've taken.
That's cool. Wow, that's a really awesome system. And I was wondering what the actual like how many instructors you have at one time teaching a class. Like, what's the kind of student to instructor ratio you guys aim for?
We aim for a student to teacher ratio of 7 to 1. Sometimes it's even more dense than that. It can be at 5 to 1. One of the things that we do is we give a heavy focus on the lab time compared to what I've seen elsewhere. It is a boot camp, and so it doesn't end at 6 o'clock. Class and mentors continue to be on shift until 9 p.m. So students and teachers are there from 9 a.m. till 9 p.m. Of course, it's not the same teachers that start in the morning that are there in the evening, and we have a pretty strong emphasis on scheduling and working with these developers outside of their primary jobs or whatever else they're doing, whether it's their own startup or freelancing, to be able to work with their schedule and accommodate the different needs. And if you look at our schedule, it's pretty insane to schedule 40 different teachers every week. Some are doing only 6 hours a week, others are doing upwards of 20 to 30 hours a week, and figuring out the weekend as well as weekday schedule for that is definitely quite intense. Having that 9 a.m. till 9 p.m. time with the teachers is one of the best feedback that we get from students when they look at and do a comparison. That's one of the things that attracts them to us, is our dedication to really making sure that they have that individual interaction with teachers. But to go back to your question, the number of mentors we have actively at any given point in our major locations, Toronto and Vancouver, is around 40 for web and about 10 to 12 for iOS. So that's about 50, 55 in total in each major location. And then in the other locations that you'll find on our website, you have Montreal, Victoria, you have Kelowna, as well as London. And so these smaller locations of ours are, as we call them, satellite locations, have local mentors as well as remote support for lectures and for assistances.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
And so, how many students do you normally have in a typical class, or what's the ideal number of students for a typical class? That's
a very good question. There's definitely a too small of a number in our experience and too high of a number in terms of the type of cohort culture and the learning environment that you want to create. We found that the ideal number is somewhere between, it's a range, is somewhere in between 20 to 24 students per cohort. And that's the number that we aim for. We have cohorts that are sometimes smaller than that, but we make sure that we don't go over 24 students per cohort, because at that point, it becomes hard for us to manage and track how the students are progressing and be able to personalize the education.
That makes a lot of sense. Cool. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about the teaching style at Lighthouse Labs. Like, how do you make sure the students have, are learning properly and absorbing the information?
Absolutely. That's a really, really good question. It's about the journey of becoming a software developer. It is not about learning JavaScript or learning Rails or learning Ruby. And we have to, remind ourselves and remind our students that on a consistent basis. So as we're doing, whether it's a lecture or a breakout or an assistance, we have to balance them learning something specific that is only about Rails versus understanding how and why that problem exists that they're encountering at the time that we're helping them with, and then helping them solve it. So one of the things that's changing actually is a heavier emphasis on pair programming. So in the first week of the program, I found a great success while experimenting with this in the pilot of this new curriculum, that the first week is heavy emphasis on pair programming. So telling the students to pair up every day. They're paired up with a different peer, and for the majority of the day, they're doing the readings and exercises and problem solving together. And so they get to kind of see the different approaches to a problem and really talk it out. There's this mindset out there of, I mean, it's less so out there now than it was before, of a software developer is really somebody who's, you know, working solo, hacking away at their computer and not really interacting with people around them. But one of the things people are starting to now realize is it's a very collaborative, conversational job, and it's not just about being, you know, on your laptop, immersed in your laptop, but really immersed in a lot of planning, ideation, and workflow and conversation around problem solving. And so we make sure that we have a lot of whiteboards and a lot of you know, ad hoc breakouts when there's an issue.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that sounds really cool. And you've mentioned that you do give the students assessments. I was wondering how regular those assessments are, and do they kind of have to pass those assessments to continue with the program and to graduate at the end?
That's a very, very good question. We definitely have gone and experimented with this quite a bit. Up until in the current, or rather the major sort of the Ruby curriculum, we had 3 assessment tests in total, which are definitely the most stressful part for students, because they're being evaluated without being able to collaborate, and in a very sort of short time span. So these tests they're not multiple choice written tests. They're simulating building things. So they're actually automated tests that are failing and producing errors that they have to fix. So it's, again, bringing it back to debugging and problem solving, and not as much around evaluating their ability to express that they've understood a concept. Those are things that can get evaluated in other ways. So the tests are focused very much on their debugging and problem solving skills. And we found that actually having 3 tests was too much for an 8-week program. You know, many students obviously made it through. It definitely gives us a way to have conversations around students that are struggling and need to be given extra attention, or have, you know, more, give them more material around the things that they're struggling with. But 3 tests we found was a little too intense in terms of stress, and we were starting to see this trend of what I call test-driven education, where students are too focused on learning for the test versus learning for the real world. And in the new curriculum that we're rolling out, there is 1 major test that happens in week 3, so still very early on. And we give them a mock test beforehand so that they feel that they're getting used to what the structure of the test looks like. So when they're actually getting the real test, they're already familiar with how to approach it, and they're focused really on the problem-solving side of things and not discovering how to even the tactics of dealing with that moment. And you know, if they don't end up doing well on the test, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not good at problem solving. The challenge with tests is that they're not perfect. Like any evaluation piece, you have to take it with a grain of salt. And so we don't just say, well, you didn't score the necessary outcome for this test, so this is going to be a challenge. We actually look at other data points that we've collected, as well as give them an opportunity to work on it in a less stressful situation and see if they can actually get through it before we, you know, have more serious conversations with them.
Okay, cool. And do you have an assessment right at the end as well to kind of check if they're ready to graduate? How does that work?
So one of the biggest changes that I'm proud of for this new curriculum is I mentioned earlier that I'm reducing the number of tests, but we're also increasing. I also mentioned that we're increasing and putting more emphasis on evaluation. Well, how are we doing that? So code reviews are a very fundamentally important part of growing as a developer. It's that feedback loop, right? Tests are an okay feedback loop. They're more of a direct evaluation. But code reviews are the more organic developer way of growing, and they happen out in the wild, right? We don't really get tests like this out in the wild aside from just technical interviews. And so there's a lot more focus on projects throughout the curriculum now, where students are actually doing less of these small exercises that are small mini apps and actually producing larger apps that are full stack web applications earlier on in the program versus later on, so they can appreciate web development sooner. And in doing so, they're also being evaluated. So these projects, when they're finished at the end of the week or in the middle of the week, students are required to actually submit them for a code review evaluation and actually get feedback and iterate on that feedback. So it's not just about getting the feedback, it's also about showing that you've listened and updated your code to fix the issues that the senior developers have pointed out. And that's something that we did informally and ad hoc before and tried to do as much as possible. But now it's a formal part that a student must complete not only the test, but also all of these different major projects that teach different technologies and are progressively more intense before they graduate. So there's the final project at the end, which is what they demo to the community as a group. But all of these solo projects that lead up to it are evaluated. And so to answer your question, these large projects provide more insight than any other aspect, and help the students figure out what they need to work on as well.
Okay, cool. That sounds awesome. And I was wondering what sort of jobs you're seeing your graduates get, and what kind of languages they're using in the jobs they're getting.
Absolutely. This is another fundamental philosophy that we have that I started with right off the bat is, I mentioned to you earlier that we're not about become a rock star developer in 8 weeks. It's a more humble and realistic approach to the journey. And to that end, our belief is very much that you still have a little ways to go before you should really be demanding these developer salaries, right? And as I mentioned to you, it's really about learning on the job and proving that you can not only learn in a bootcamp environment, but that you can learn and grow and work with other people while contributing to the software of that company. So we encourage our students and our career services department, which is made up of multiple people, to help all the students and all the alumni in the different locations seek out developer opportunities. They encourage the students and the employers to start with an internship model, a paid internship, or better, an apprenticeship, if you will, where they are being compensated, but there is a 3-month internship period before they are graduating to a junior developer title within that company. And that's what we encourage the employers. And that is something that has been extremely well received in Vancouver, in Toronto, and across Canada by employers, is that the realistic approach of, our graduates are more humble and understand that they have a few more months of intense learning before they graduate to that junior level position.
That's really cool. I like that idea of the students going into internships. Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to wrap this up in a second, I think. But just before we go, I just wondered if you have any kind of favorite resources or meetups in Vancouver for aspiring boot campers who want to kind of find out more about what it's like to learn to code.
Absolutely. There are quite a few amazing meetups in Vancouver. There's different meetups for front-end developers who are more interested in that, as well as full stack or back-end developers. One of my favorites is the Polyglot meetup, which is not as focused on a specific ecosystem or language. The Ruby meetup is very active. There's Ruby Hack Nights that happen in Vancouver on a bi-weekly basis. There is a CSS brigade that is not as frequent, but also has a huge turnout, run by a really, really interesting group of developers out here. There's some really interesting services and product companies in Vancouver, large like Hootsuite, more corporate and less directly software like TELUS that are big employers of Lighthouse Labs as well. And they're constantly encouraging the community to have to provide space and to provide the resources to have these meetups. And we encourage our students to go to at least one or two in the process of being in the bootcamp, and then of course as they graduate to hit up a lot more. The web performance meetup is also a personal favorite of mine. It's definitely a little bit more advanced, so it's more for our alumni, I feel, than our current students. And one that is a little bit less around technology, but more around the community and entrepreneurship is the HackerNest meetup, where you get a lot of entrepreneurs and people with ideas coming to the meetup looking for developers to be able to prototype and create these MVPs for them. So we have students with different aspirations, some that want to work at bigger, more stable companies, and others that want to be entrepreneurs and co-founders. And so HackerNest is a great meetup for the latter.
Awesome, cool. Oh, that's super useful. I think this whole interview is going to be really useful for anyone thinking about doing a boot camp in Canada, and especially if they're thinking about Lighthouse Labs. It's so interesting, all about the curriculum and all how you figure out which instructors go where and all that kind of thing. Very interesting. So thank you so much, Khurram, for making time to chat with me today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Imogen, as well. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and having the time. And I'm really excited with what we're doing in the near future and the types of changes we're making internally as well as with our curriculum. So thanks for letting me speak about that.
Cool, no worries. Yeah, good luck with it. And yeah, I'll speak to you again soon.
Okay, ciao.
Bye.